everybody. I'm again sorry lack of notice. I need to get back on track and doing better with that. But that's I feel like these are just the weeks that are happening to me. I'm trying to squeeze this in between things going on. So that's what happens. I get caught in the squeeze. I got a couple things going on. So first, well, as is this stream is titled. We're going to keep kind of plugging away at the concepts that we've been doing over the last couple of streams on dungeons, and we started with a cyclical dungeon design, but we've kind of moved past that a bit, or it's morphed into something else, which is good. Which is good. That's kind of how it should be. Doing a little bit of house cleaning here. Where is the yes? Let's see. I'm gonna just give this a color. It's called red. Um, yeah, where we start, we kept going. Hey, Red Caps. I will mention, and Red Caps, thanks for the signal boost earlier. I posted a blog post called Dungeon Defenses from the Perspective of Their Inhabitants. You can find on hext.press. I probably should link that in the, actually, I can link it in the chat, and then later on, I'll add it to the show notes. Folks are interested in checking that out. It's a lot of basically kind of working on the concepts that we looked at yesterday. Um, and essentially just trying to kind of, as I was thinking about it, trying to think things through a little bit, and just kind of figure out, well, what do you do when you like these concepts are fine, and I'm totally happy at times to just go on and sort of I don't know, kind of meta theory land. But I always try to think back to, or I always at some point come back to, like, well, what can I do with this stuff? Like, what good is it? And some of the stuff, like as I was writing out this blog post, and I was thinking of these types of barriers, these defenses that we're putting up. Right, I thought, okay, well, seems like there's three main ones. There's other ones. I was thinking. I mean, not that I'm not certainly not omniscient, right? That maybe there's some other option there, but sentinels in terms of sort of living, or at least defenders, doesn't have to be. I mean, I guess I should put living in quotes, but animals, creatures, things like that. Could be guard dogs, could be guards, could be golems, other constructs, undead, things like that. Sentinels. They're your sort of in a sense active defenders. They're moving around. They're doing stuff. Obstacles are things like walls. You plunk a wall down, a gate, a portcullis, something like that. We're like, nope, can't get in here. And then a trap is, a trap, some sort of device that is triggered. If a sentinel is an active kind of defense, then a trap, in a sense, is a passive defense, in that it is waiting to be triggered. It is not actively going and seeking out, or even actively looking. It's waiting for that trigger, but it hit the trigger and it goes. So these are kind of the main defenses. And as I said in the we all talked about yesterday, and I said and I mentioned the blog post, there's kind of two different things you can do. One is it's a deterrent, right? You're making a show of having this here, and I think lots of things that we see out in the world, a lot of it is deterrence. If you have a security agency sign on your lawn, I think we all know, unfortunately, that if somebody's intent on invading your home, that's not stopping them, because by the time whatever alarm is triggered, and then the security company comes, or they do whatever and they get over there, there's some kind of clock. If it's a really if you're, I don't know, if you're a billionaire and you've got something, maybe it's minutes, single digit minutes, maybe it's 10 minutes. You hope it's kind of like calling the police department or the fire department, something like that, right? It's like in the movies, you see somebody hit the stopwatch. Okay, the 911's been called. We have 3 minutes, right? But you still have that 3 minutes. But what you are doing is you're deterring a lot of folks that don't know all the ins and outs, aren't involved with that, and are just like, oh gosh, if I do this, I'm gonna get caught, or whatever. It's that deterrent, right? Oh, I'm not as much of a hardened criminal or whatever to do this. Maybe I would have stolen on Garden Gnome if I didn't see the sign, but since I saw it, it's like, it's not worth the trouble. I'm not gonna do it. That's kind of deterrence. And then the other factor is that threat neutralizing. You're just trying to stop the threat. Whereas a deterrent is kind of trying to stop it before it starts. Put up a big enough show of force to say, like, nope, don't want any part of that. The threat neutralizing part is like, is just saying, like, this is just to stop you, right? One is to kind of a preventative measure, and one is an actual They're both preventative measures. One is sort of trying to, I don't want to use deter. I forget what I used in my blog, essentially, in the blog post. Yeah, but one is basically trying to stop it before it starts. The other one's like, okay, stuff's going down. Let's stop it, kind of thing. Right. So we got those elements. And then what we talked about yesterday was these concepts of sort of your primary, which I've now I might change it to public. I mean public kind of in quotes, but if the public part is that the part of your place that you, like I said here, the front door. It's not that you're always allowing anybody, but if someone's going to show up, you're expecting them to show up to your front door, right? Somebody rings your front doorbell, you're most likely to open it up and or at least look through the eye hole or whatever and kind of give it some sort of benefit of, okay, they're coming to my front door. If someone shows up at your back door, you're automatically on guard a little bit because that's not where you're supposed to be. That's that other level, that secondary, that restricted level. Like, okay, maybe you could get over to the back door because it's not impossible, but that's weird that you came through my backyard and are now standing at my back door. Maybe you've knocked, maybe you haven't, but otherwise, that's weird. Uh, Red Cap says they missed the first two parts, but they heard a bit of part one. The first thing that came to mind was using the vault as a distraction so you can get to your goal. Yeah, totally, Red Cap. I mean, that's kind of, I think you're kind of hitting at sort of what I hope to be the ultimate takeaway of all this stuff is to kind of use these things. You can use them in kind of how you're thinking about adventures. And then once the party is aware of these things, they can use them potentially too, because I hope is that they kind of make some kind of sense logically in the way things are. Yeah, if you have to get something out of the bank, maybe the most obvious thing you're getting out of the bank is something out of the vault, right? But there's all kinds of fun can be had if what if the thing you're trying to get out of the bank isn't the vault at all. And this does comes up. Usually it's often like it'll come up as a twist, right? Oh, what if they weren't going after that at all? What? What? They didn't want the money. Like they were doing this other thing. The original Jack Reacher movie, which I know a lot of people read the books, I guess don't like because Tom Cruise is nothing like the Jack Reacher character in stature or whatever, but I really enjoyed that movie, and the concept there of an assassin trying to target one person by covering it up by targeting a bunch of people, so that the person they were targeting specifically gets lost in the noise. Kind of similar to that, right? Oh, we got this. If we trigger this and this everybody's concentrating on the vault of the bank, then we can go nab the bank manager, get this other thing, or do whatever other business we need to do that doesn't actually involve the vault. Like you can have a lot of fun with that. So we got all this stuff, and it's like, okay, well, what do we do with these things? I think, and you can read the blog post, but I think to me, there's a good case of what you can do with kind of sentinels, obstacles, traps in terms of thinking about your dungeons. Either if you're generating a dungeon, like here's the layer of so and so, or maybe you're filling up a space. You have a cave network and you're starting to put factions inside that cave network. You can start to think about, well, if these goblins are in this corner of this cave network, what are the kind of things they would do? Because often we just kind of plunk them in there and say, okay, here are the goblins, right? Goblins are in this quadrant of the caves, but not that that's a bad way to go. But I think thinking about like, okay, well, they're there. And if this is where they live, then we could think about, well, how are we how are we filling out the contents? What do these caves look like from the goblins' perspective? They're going to need to defend themselves. They're going to want to put up defenses. And then you can think about, well, what can they afford to do? Can they afford to have guards everywhere? Probably not. They could probably put a guard somewhere, but they're small. They need all hands on deck to go get food or whatever they're doing to feed themselves. They don't live in there in isolation. They got to generate resources. Guards and sentinels, even if they're animals, require resources. You're keeping war pigs as guard dogs, guard kind of animals. That's great, but you got to feed them. So all these different people you're putting as sentinels, assuming you don't have access to undead or constructs or things like that, they all have to come out of the pie of resources and they can't contribute. You can't have those same pigs, can't be out looking for truffles because they're on guard duty. And you most likely need to have some kind of person, individual, can't probably just don't have just the pigs. Probably got somebody there. Either somebody has to be their trainer, right? You have somebody, even another resource on top of that to train, maintain, take care of these pigs. They're someone who's not doing the other stuff. It's kind of a specialized occupation. So now the rest of this community, however large it is, has to then take care of them. How do they do that? Probably means you can't have too many of them. So then maybe you're starting on the obstacles part. Well, we can't guard all our exits. We're going to use obstacles to figure out which exits we need. Ideally, at least two. One for the public access, and then some way out of there if things go wrong. Ideally, you might not be able to manage it, but I that's probably what you want, I would imagine. So, what are we going to do if you're in the middle of a dungeon where there might be a whole bunch of corridors or cave tunnels or anything that are all coming into your territories? You're probably going to want to figure out some way of limiting that access, whether it's putting in gates and portcullises, whether it's just walling it up, whatever you're doing, you probably want to do that. And then the traps aspect is, well, we can't guard everywhere we want to guard. We just don't have the manpower. We'd love to put guards everywhere in every room, but we can't. So which areas are probably least likely to get so much traffic that it would make having a trap there either just an accident waiting to happen, or it would be always turned off or something like that, right? We probably want to put the trap somewhere to kind of watch our backs in the places we're not there. And that's kind of traps. And that's in the blog post. But as I keep thinking about, okay, we have these, we were talking about yesterday the access points. In my example that I wrote up, I sort of mocked up these different access. So the dashed lines being the secondary access, and the triangles being the dashed lines being sort of secondary passages, the triangles being secondary accesses like doors, essentially, or it could be something else. But right, those are your access points, and then the filled squares were the primary access points. But something I didn't think about until I started working through this, getting ready for this stream, and also just kind of working through things, is we can also designate places as basically your public kind of facing places, your primary places, and then restricted, or maybe I should say, I've been using spaces in my documentation, but I'll just use places for right now. You might have you have your public kind of places, primary places, you have your restricted places, and then you have your kind of unconventional kind of places. Again, those would be things like sewer, Jeffrey's tubes on a starship. Right? You might go in there to do maintenance, but generally you're not expecting people to be crawling around in there. It's not what they're for, right? It's some kind of sewer thing. Wall outside of walls would be something like, yeah, if you're in a manor house that's 3 stories tall, you can climb out the outside to get to the third story. That's not it's in no way is that what people are expecting out of that wall. They might know it's a possibility, hence you might want to map or think something about it, like putting little, you know, putting bars on the windows or something like that, right? But you're not. It's not a conventional access way, unless of course maybe you're an insectoid people, in which case maybe that's the primary method is to crawl along the outside and go in through the top, right? Who knows? But humans and humanoid types for the most part. I mean, it is an interesting thing. If you were playing, say, with bird people or something else, then your these access points might look totally different. A bird person, it might be that the primary access point is through the roof, fly up into the roof. It's perfect. And the unconventional access would be some kind of shaft or doorway in the floor, which maybe they would only use for their sewage. They just dump it down the bottom of their whatever their sort of nest structure is. I don't know, right? You could have some fun with that too. So we have these areas, hallways. We were talking about yesterday, kind of connecting passages, hallways, so on and so forth. But we can also look at it for areas. Like here, going back to my little mock-up here, this entranceway would be a primary or public-facing area. So would the grand gallery. Guest quarters, probably not restricted. This kind of library here, this is more for the Lord and family, restricted. Definitely master bedroom, restricted. All basically everything else but these two, right? So the entrance and the grand gallery, public. Everything else would be restricted. If I wanted to map some kind of sewage sort of situation or something else, like something of similar, I could map those in as tertiary access. And I could probably think about levels of restricted access also, but just as a start, right? We can, just not to get too into the nitty gritty, we could think about this sort of public access first for not only for hallways and stuff, but there's a truck right outside. Public access for sort of rooms and hallways, any kind of space, restricted access, and then unconventional access. So now, which I typed up at the beginning of this whole shebang, what can we do with these designations? So great, we've done that. Say, all right, Todd, I went through my dungeon and I took colored pens or I highlighted stuff in Photoshop or whatever, and I kind of color coded, did whatever, used all kinds of different lines, squigglies to denote these different types. What can we other than kind of the stuff we already sort of talked about? What can we do with it? Well, there's a few things we can do, right? So part of the reason why I'm trying to generate these ideas is yes, I think they can help from a design part of coming up with a space that kind of makes sense in some kind of organic way. In that it's understandable, you can say it, and therefore I think when you're in that space as a player, you can make more of it because it kind of follows rules you understand. You might not know exactly what the rules are, but you kind of will kind of get them. When you go to a restaurant and you see the employees only door, you don't know necessarily what's behind that door, but you understand what's happening, right? Or you see the emergency exit. You're like, oh, and so if you were in a restaurant or in a building and all of a sudden things go die hard in there, that you could take that emergency stairway. It might set off alarms. Maybe you want that, maybe you don't, but you can get out that, you can do something in there, right? So that's kind of what I'm aiming for from that standpoint. From a mechanical standpoint, in terms of running the dungeon, what do we do with the things? Well, some things we could do is they can be reaction modifiers. And I don't have these pre-thought up, right? We could have some reaction modifiers. If you are an adventuring party, and let's say you're in some kind of multi-faction dungeon area, Frederick says, every once in a while my mic acts up. Well, sorry about that. I don't know what to do. If it's happening consistently, I can probably do something about it, but I'm not seeing anything on mine. But I appreciate it might be me popping. I might have it too close to me. I might be, I don't know if it's my popping, my plosives. I'll try to keep it in check. Um, so we have reaction modifiers, right? So what if we were to say something like, if you're in the public access space, you're in that primary space. Now, granted, we can get all kinds of details you want, right? But generally, let's just say during business hours. Okay, you're in a castle of a lord, but you're in this manor house. You're hanging around in the entrance. You're probably not going to be, unless you're doing something really suspicious. You're probably going to be. You're not going to be. I think people aren't going to be particularly what's the word I'm like? You're going to be pretty safe in terms of, or neutral, I should say, maybe in terms of how people react to you, because it's okay. Like a castle during the day or an office building, people are walking in and out on business all the time, right? You're not going to stand out. So you might say in a primary kind of public space has a zero modifier. All right, plus minus plus zero, or I'm gonna say minus zero. Redcap says, so many players have been conditioned for the less than realistic class dungeon. How would you condition them this dynamic? What's the show, not tell way of getting into the mindset? Uh, that's a that's a really good question, Redcap. I'm not sure, other than maybe to tell to tell them. I mean, I got a lot of mileage in my game with players who were really new to the OSR kind of space. Is just being super upfront in that kind of session zero type situation of kind of laying everything out. Um, I think you can also, if you wanted to kind of reset things maybe as you go, if they have a hireling or somebody, you could kind of try to sort of hip them to things. But it's a really it's a really good kind of question, because I'm not totally sure unless you just start doing it and you just see if they kind of catch on to it. But it's also could be too is where you're putting your dungeons. And they oh boy. What are your dungeons? Because one of the things, and I don't know, Red Caps, if you saw, I did a video a little while back on running your dungeons like heists, and saying basically your dungeon could be any kind of building. So if your party's doing stuff where they're engaging with structures that are more or less conventional in appearance, like a manor house or an actual castle, as opposed to a more fantastic, here's like 1,000 caves buried underground, then I think then when they might have more of a grounding for conceptualizing it as that kind of structure, where they're thinking about, in a manor house there might be servants quarters and then little passages connecting these servants quarters, right? That's something that makes more sense, where if you're in the kind of a real fantastic, the sort of fantastic underworld, mythical underworld kind of location, then part of the mythical part is like, well, I don't know what to expect, right? We don't know, we have no idea what the heck's going on. So that might be part of it. But yeah, it's a really good question. Chris says, the work to go from vague idea to fully detailed dungeon map is always a hard hump. Processes like this are way more helpful than endless random tables. Well, cool. Well, It's this is will eventually be hopefully not in too short in not too long order into a kind of module to go with my do anything D6. So hopefully these tools will be available sooner rather than later. And I hope that they're helpful people. So far the feedback on the streams has been good for people kind of getting use out of them. So that's always a good sign. Hey Ian. Frederick says break out of impel down and meet an old enemy. Do you team up with them to get out? That's a good, always a good option to have to team up with your enemies. Um, but yeah, back to the red caps point of how do you show kind of not telling. I think it's just making the spaces as they're entering them. I think you can do stuff. So to go back to our example here, right? You're in the grand gallery. You see the side door kind of open up and a servant come in and out, right? That kind of cues you into this door. And what I meant in red caps, like, because I think you missed it yesterday, is part of the idea of tagging these doors with the symbols would be that whereas, say, from the grand gallery to the entrance hall, these doors, these kind of primary doors, are very visible. They're big. They may be grand if their budget afforded it, carved, and they're showy. They're meant to show you here is this big impressive door. Whereas these little side doors going into the kitchens, they might be sort of flush on the wall, not technically secret, but they're trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. I'm sure we've all seen it where you see a house or on a big kind of a room and it's got beautiful wallpaper, and then there's some kind of access door that is kind of flush with the wall. It's got the wallpaper over it. And you can just see kind of the cutout of the door. Maybe there's just a very subtle door handle, or maybe not even a handle at all, where it's coming in and out because it's just supposed to be sort of out of the way. It's supposed to be almost invisible, like the servants are supposed to be pretty much invisible. That's why I thought it was a good idea to me, or useful anyway, to be able to point out the different levels of doors. Um, okay, so back to this. So we have reaction modifiers. If you're in a primary public space, presumably during business hours, right? Because you can, if you want to get technical with it, right? You could say this place is a public space from 9 to 5, but at 5 o'clock when it closes, the whole place becomes restricted because you're not supposed to be there after dark or after closing, whatever it is. Okay. But right now we're talking about sort of in generic usage. But the nice thing is you can have all these. If you want to have a day night cycle, or you want to have a days of the week cycle, some other cycle, you can totally play around with that. You can set the rules, because that's kind of what this whole thing is about, is setting rules that you can then use. And once you've internalized these kind of rules and the usages, then you don't really have to think of them over much. You can just go with it. So your reaction modifiers. We love reactions. I love reactions. You're in that primary or public space. Your reaction is what it is. However else you modify it, but you're in a space you're kind of supposed to be. If you're going to be visiting this place, you are in the visiting area. That's fully on board. Okay, but now you move from one of those areas and you slip, sneak, force your way into a restricted space. Well, now maybe you're at -4. You can change the number to whatever you want on a what 2d6 or whatever, or if it's depending on d6, whatever you're using, you can make it. But it should be the idea here is you should be. It's you're caught in. This is when you end up in that part of the restaurant, the office building, and someone looks around and goes, "Hey, what are you doing here?" Right? You don't belong here. You are not an employee. You are not supposed to be there. So now your reaction modifier much less. I'm not going to worry in unconventional access, because you're kind of really not supposed to be there. No one's supposed to be there. But you could probably make that even worse. Like, right, if you're caught climbing up the side of a building, I mean, you could say we want to make it. And again, I'm not. I haven't any diced these out. So let's just say unconventional space. We could do this if we want to make it nice and even. We could do that. Because if you're caught in the sewers or in the Jeffries tube or climbing up the side of the building or something else, if you're caught over there, yeah, they're probably going to be like, okay, you're totally up to no good. You are not supposed to be here, right? For real, nobody's supposed to be here. So now you can come back if you just kind of remember that -2, -4 kind of thing, and you internalize that. Then when you're looking at your little schematic kind of map here, and the PCs they're in the grand gallery and they've found a way to slip into the kitchen or in the garden, and some chef or serving person turns around and sees them when you're rolling for reactions, oh yeah, this is restricted because again, this one's not color coded, but I could have used dashed lines, or maybe I used a different color, whatever it is. Oh my gosh, that's going to be bad. I mean, and it makes sense because the party would know. I presume if you're the party would also know that it would be bad because they're not supposed to be there. But now you've kind of mechanized it in a very easy to remember way. I don't have to look up. I don't have to look through my other notes. I don't have to go dig up anything. If I know kind of my what my reaction role logic is, and I've got that, then I've got it right. I just add a little modifier to it. Badam, badim, done. You can do that. So there's one use. What if we were doing some kind of wandering creature tables? I mean, we know we love our wandering creature tables. What if we let's see, what if well let me consider like what if we overload them with a modifier depending on the space? So let's say you're in oh, I don't know. You're in what's a good trope, right? The the it could be the scientist, the wizard who seems kindly, seems to be doing fun stuff, but that's the idea is like behind the scenes they're actually doing really evil stuff, right? But they've put up a wonderful front. The kindly old wizard who's been trying to seek out the the cure for some disease is the one that's actually putting the disease out there. This stuff comes up. I'm trying to think of an example, a recent example. Or here's one, right? The in the Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves movie, the I forget his name's Hugh Grant's character, right? Ha ha ha, nice and charming on the outside, working with a red, what do they call them? A red priest? No, red wizard behind the scenes. You're gonna have in the primary public spaces, all's gonna seem well. You might if your wandering creature tables was, let's say, oh, let's just put up let me just put up a quickie template here. Let's just do a let's hold on a minute. Let me like to do things a certain way. Generic wandering creature table. So we'll do, 2 to 6. Actually, no. Let's do what I'm not sure what a good one is. Oh, well, actually, no. I do know what a good one is. Let's just do 2d6. 1 to 6 would just be sort of a servant. Let's see. 7 to 8 would be I don't know. What would be 7 to 8? Um, I don't know. One of the wizard students. Terrence, hey Terrence, says that Hugh Grant's comedy chops are underrated. I really thought he was good. I mean, I liked him in the D&D movie. I thought he was good in Paddington. Um, I mean, he's always had I think Terrence, he's had the comedy things in a lot of his roles, but he went from sort of his comedy is different now, right? Because he was going from the sort of supposed to be charming, kind of bumbling, right? Sort of self-deprecating comedy to this other sort, which I guess to maybe more of a straight up comedy. I don't know. 9 to 10 maybe would be a guard, and 11 to 12 is the wizard themselves. Something like that. Let's just say we're just going to take that, right? We're just going to take that as our generic wandering creature table. What if we said that in the primary or public space, we're going to modify this with like we could say a 0. We might even want to put a negative number on there, but we'll put, and we could do something like, well, actually, no, we could do really, because it would be nice. What I kind of like to do is where there's a lot of, um, where there is sort of synergy or it's just easy. So we could just say something like that. So now we have these spaces, and these spaces can then inform what creatures we're gonna encounter in those spaces, and we didn't have to do anything, right? We have our wandering creature table already. It's already there. We did it for this dungeon, whatever this location. It's done. We had to do that anyway. We could take that same one, but now we're our statements are we're making statements, and you can change around this table to, if it makes more sense, right? If you want, maybe in the public spaces, you're more likely to see the students, and then the servants might be more like you can play with the numbers. I'm not really intent here on trying to make it, but the idea is that in that restricted space, and remember, we can have a generic. So the other thing with all these designations we're doing and what they mean is we can have a generic one just for our game. We can override it for different spaces. In this place, we can say, oh, if you're in a tertiary unexpected space, now it's minus 4 because we want, only servants are more likely to be seeing this than anybody else. Something like that, right? You could flip flop these numbers around as much as you want. But the point is that you can just kind of have them. And once you have them, you can use them in a bunch of different ways, which I hope to make your life a little bit easier. So you're looking at your map, you're doing stuff, and I don't have to have necessarily set encounters on a per room basis. I can have one table and then just modify the odds and things with this kind of thing that's also doing double duty by having it be a reaction modifier. So if I'm in a restricted space, I'm more likely to run into the students, guards, or the wizards, who are also more likely to be negative. So you get some nice kind of synergy there. You could also talk about, what if you're doing just your wandering creature checks. Start with 1 and 6, mod by space type. So maybe you take these and you say, in this case, yeah, your chances of having encounter in a public space are fairly high. Restricted space, maybe not so much. And in an unconventional space, even maybe less. Or you maybe say 0. Or maybe start with 2 and 6 if you want to we start with 2 and 6. That way we can modify and say, yeah, -1. Now I can write this up for my dungeon space. I can come up with my master wandering creature table, and then I can simply just make myself some rules. You're in the public space, yeah, you have it's a 50% chance you're gonna run into somebody because that's where everybody's hanging out. That's literally the public spaces are literally where people should be hanging out most of the time. You're able to slip down into a side place. They're not as well trafficked because people are just doing their work, but you're maybe more likely to run into whatever some of these people. If you're in an unconventional space like the sewers, maybe you say, yeah, uh it's harder. Yeah, you're less likely. You go from a 30% chance to only about a 15% chance that somebody's in the right place at the right time because nobody should really be down there to check on you. But then if they do, it's probably going to be a guard or the wizard themselves. And which is, given that they're also going to be pretty negative, mostly negative reaction towards you, you don't want to get caught in there, which makes sense. I think from just sort of a fiction standpoint, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to go for here, right? Is this stuff that, like, okay, it makes sense. It makes sense. I can kind of map these things out one time for my dungeon, and then I can leverage a bunch of this stuff for multiple dungeons if I have just kind of a generic set of rules, and then I can override them wherever I want. Um, does that make sense? Am I have I explained that in a way? Now, not to say you have to do it or not. I mean, this is something, I like to do this stuff for myself, and I hope it's useful to other people. But in terms of, well, what am I actually doing here? That's kind of the thing I'm doing. That's why I try to define stuff, and I want to get these things out there, is because I can make these kinds of give myself these kinds of hooks, mechanical hooks. I should say I can use them for different things if it makes sense. I could have other things, right? If I wanted to have the difficulty, let's say if there's a locked chest that's in a secondary space, I can make myself a quick rule. If it's usually DC, if we're on a D20, let's say it's usually DC 10 to unlock. If it was just a chest that's sitting in the public hallway, then maybe I say if it's in the restricted area, maybe a chest in the restricted in the public hallway is not locked at all. They don't put anything in it because they know that people are just be wandering around opening the chest all the time. They don't even bother. It's just there as a something to sit on. It's just decorative. But if you're in the restricted space, then such a thing would be locked and it might have a DC 12. And if there's such a thing in the sewers, maybe it has a different rule or some other kind of unconventional space. And I don't mean it to be super prescriptive, prescriptive, prescriptive. Because someone, I think it was Brian Smith, when I posted some of those things on the forums, and he had spotted my HD references, which are here are basically challenge levels, hazard difficulty, hazard difficulty, right? So we have challenge. We can add those levels to this and say, oh, okay, it's one, which is basically it's your default, just in general. But then the guard room, it's harder. That's the hardest one actually. And then the library, the bedroom are higher. I'm not trying to do necessarily. I know Index Card RPG did a thing where you basically have a challenge rating for a space, but I'm not trying to be prescriptive in that. Like I set the Grand Gallery to one, so everything inside there is one, and that's because it is. I don't love that aspect of it. I really like the idea of saying, hey, I'm being more descriptive. I'm making this one because by default, I want everything in here to be like, yeah, it's challenge level one, and I can just use that just in the fiction. If I want to make rolls, I can do that, but I can also override it with something more specific. So I think the example I gave Brian Smith was if we take the if we were to kind of put all this stuff together, that's probably a good idea. Let's throw all this stuff kind of together. What hold on a minute. Let's take the grand gallery, right? So the grand gallery. So this is what it might look like if I were writing this up. HD1. Okay. Grand Gallery HD1 public space. Boom. All right. That tells us already that tells us the majority of what we need to know. I mean, whatever the description you can get in, we could put tags in there, kind of things. But just in terms of putting aside the particulars of what color the drapes are and the smells and everything, and just in terms of basics, the Grand Gallery HD1 public space. Boom. This tells us a lot. Okay. Now we got our doors. So now we got yeah. So door in door. We got like let's say we have let's see, yeah, we have we'll go clockwise. So we have door to entrance, which is also public unlocked. We've got door to guest quarters. And I might change that to restricted, but we're just going to call it at the moment. That's how I made it public unlocked. We've got door to guard room, and then it's restricted. Unlocked. And then we have the whoops, hold on. I've skipped. I skipped. No. No, why did you do that, Ouija? Just wanted to add. Why did you do that? Okay. No, wait. Door to entrance, door to the, whoops, sorry, that was the wrong one. I wanted to put it in here. Door to library. It's public, but it's locked. That would probably be restricted, I guess I keep thinking of more things that I get in here, but and then we had door to servants, no, kitchen restricted, unlocked. Something like that. Dave says, I think it makes a lot of sense. Likes the guidelines. I appreciate it. The red cap says it might be HD1 to blend in with the gang gallery or to spot basic things. But if you try to pickpocket some other noble in the gathering, it might be HD3. Yeah, I mean, like I said, red caps. Yeah, these are meant to be sort of guidelines, right? If you have something more specific, it would override it. The idea with these hazard difficulties is they just give you something like if the party just does something and you're not sure. I don't know what that is. I don't have anything. Well, it's you can kind of it's crowded enough, it's whatever. But yeah, if you're suddenly you're in a noble, if you're hanging around the nobles, that's not going to be easy just because you're in this easy area. That's going to be more difficult, and we would modify it accordingly. Right. Like I'm really talking more about like the stuff that's part of the space. Totally all kinds of context stuff is going to come in. And that's part of why I want to give as me as a dungeon master or referee and for others, I don't want to I don't want to get rid of that. And I'd have to go back and read the index card RPG game, but I felt like with that it was more like prescriptive in that like you set this as HD1, so anything you do in this room is HD1. Like no, it's not it. What I'm saying is more is looking at it like you're making a hierarchy of hazards is the kind of note I left myself. You're in the grand gallery, that's HD1. Uh, we could say that this locked door, the door to the library is locked. It's an HD, right? Locked. It's actually it will be HD2. So already right there we have that one that's locked, right? So if you had there was some other something in there, we could then give that, right? The guard room is HD3 in a sense because it's full of guards all the time. So how much are you going to be able? That's kind of why I said HD3. It's full of guards, they're all armed, and they're all going to be suspicious if somebody's walking in there doing stuff. So that's like, okay, it's just harder. Um, but you could have something in there like, well, if you can get to they've got a lockbox or something in there. Maybe the lockbox is only HD1 because they're not who's gonna try to steal from our lockbox when we have a room full of guards? Well, they didn't count on Thiefy McThief doing it, so that gets modified separately. But the idea is that you can form this maybe I should just write it down, a hierarchy of hazards. I'm not trying to lock you in. The goal here is not to lock you into a single overarching difficulty, nor does it say anything about the people who are in here. If you're in the Grand Gallery 1 and a bunch of guards run in, they're not the guards themselves that encounter is not at a certain strength because you're in an HD1 room. Um, it's still whatever it is. If there's 12 guards in that room and 12 guards run out, and each one of those 12 guards is a level 2 fighter or whatever that is, it doesn't have to correspond to the difficulty. Like it's not all, I'm not locking them all together. However, if you're in a pinch, you're not sure, you can use that HD number to start with. But right. So we're going so just to fill out this hierarchy of hazards idea, we're start with the general, you know, override with the more specific as needed. And it's descriptive rather than prescriptive. But you can use these to kind of loop things in. These hazard difficulties also work for this other things too. What are we doing in these designations? You're in an HD3 spot. Maybe when we go back to our generic wandering creature table, that turns out to be a +3. So you're more likely to get a student, a guard, or the wizard because you're in a spot that really only most part only the guards and the wizards and maybe student will be going in there. But you're going to be getting a lot of guards, or you can have your own table, right? This is to help you, right? It's not again. I'm not trying to lock you into any particular uh, pattern that isn't useful. If you have something here, if this was say a wizard's lab and you had a wizard's lab here, your generic your generic table might not work, right? Because you might say, well, there's not going to be so much chance of a servant showing up in the laboratory. They don't let the servants in the laboratory. They don't let the guards in the laboratory either. It's either going to be students, wizard, or maybe some abomination that they've summoned. Okay, great. So that one, then the specifics will demand that you override that table with the other one. That's great. But you might have a bunch of spaces in here. Assume, I'm doing this, let's say, is for my home game. I got a, and maybe this is more of an area, right? I assume more than one guest kind of quarter. I don't necessarily want, I don't have a big feel for who's going to be in there. So I'm like, you know what? It's just going to be we're just going to use this wandering table, but I can go ahead and use that one, or I can use something else to say, you know what? But there's this kind of things going on. I can just kind of roll up to the more general one because I don't have a specific one and I don't need it. So that saves me having to do much work. And that's really the default, right? The default is you have if a dungeon doesn't tell you anything specifically, you go to the dungeon wide encounter table, you roll on that. And it's kind of the same thing. I'm just trying to put maybe a little bit more logic into it or maybe a little more flexible instead of tying it to a specific space that in this quadrant this is. And then if, what happens if I have two areas in the quadrant that don't really match up together? Do I have to split them up? Do I do whatever? It's like, no, you just kind of give them slightly different designations and then go from there. As soon as you make one primary access and the other one is restricted, then that is going to change just by itself. If you're using it, it's going to kind of change the not only the odds of your encounters, but kind of the flavor of them as well. That's the thought. Now, obviously, I'm kind of I'm writing all this stuff up and talking about it, which really helps. It's not in its, I would say, it's not in its final form. I mean, I think a lot of this stuff I'm going to keep. I like the Sentinels, obstacles, traps. I think that's good. I like kind of thinking of the access in terms of the spaces, in terms of public, restricted, and unconventional. I kind of like that. I think a lot of this though is just the tools, right? I want to give you the tools, and then you can take those tools and do whatever the heck you like. Do whatever you want with them. But hopefully, it'll make it kind of easier. Whether you're running your own, because part of it too is part of my whole thinking with why I was sort of doing this to begin with is two things. Some of these tools, like a lot we're talking about here, is kind of most suited to creating your own dungeon. How can you take a dungeon and go from a concept you may have, a need? Oh, the party's decided to infiltrate this noble's house. What does the house look like? What kind of things do I need to plan up? I'm hoping that, like I kind of did that was what I was thinking about when I sort of mocked up this map here, was simply a noble's manor house. What kind of, and I started looking at, well, what kind of rooms do I need? Would when you're building this thing, like what is the flow? I missed yesterday. What does that flow look like? And what are the kind of different access ways? You have the public one, which is when you're inviting your guests into your home and you show them into this and you show them in there, whatever. But clearly, they're not supposed to go in the kitchens. They're not supposed to go in the guard room. They're not supposed to go into your private space. That sort. So you can already visualize and say, okay, we have some spaces that we need to connect in there because they exist and they need to get around. The servants need to be able to access different areas, but other people don't, and that's restricted kind of thing. So there's part of that is that element, and probably a lot of what we've been talking about today would fall into that. I need to build a space. What do I, how do I put it together? How do I go from that concept? I think for a lot of purposes, you could end with this kind of schematic map. I don't think you need to make a really pretty map. You can, of course, if you want to make it's always going to depend on your game. I think you could just kind of stop. I could run this location with a map like this, totally fine, but you could also draw it up and make it all 10 foot or 5 foot squares and do all that stuff, which is totally useful. Use them all the time, but up to your needs. The other angle is that you get a dungeon. You get a dungeon in some format, some and obviously different designers, different people make dungeons, have very different ways of putting their dungeons together. Some of them give you more information, some less. Some give you a lot of information, but then you find out it's not the information that you really need. Some don't. And part of my thinking was, what if you were given a dungeon, or you got a dungeon, or you really like some aspects of the dungeon, but you're going through it and a lot of it maybe is not either what you want or it's not giving you the information you need. Oftentimes these products are imperfect. I mean, they're written like everything is, they're kind of written for maybe a certain style of play, a certain way of doing the workflow, and it's not your workflow. Maybe it doesn't work that great with you. You could struggle to try to fit those two things together, try to change the way you do things for the way the dungeon's written. But what I'm kind of trying to do also is hopefully give some methods of, hey, I've got this dungeon. I really like the layout, or I really like these other things, but I don't love that I can't find these things, or it doesn't give me the information. It'll just say something like, this is hard, or this is easier. Hey, it's locked. And they don't give me anything about it. Maybe they're not doing it because they're trying to be super generic, right? So they're not going to give me rules for how hard it is a lock on this thing because they're assuming that I'm going to use a BX style locking or something else, or they don't know what, so they're not going to have it. Well, I can maybe go through and I can kind of build this schematic. I can take their dungeon, I can write myself some notes, or I can just assume everything. I can look at and say, well, this is a dungeon for levels 3 to 5. So I'm going to say it's HD3 on level one, HD4 on level two, and HD5 on level five on level three, which gives me that kind of 3 to 5 level sort of flow. Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. You can tweak it. I mean, I'm just trying to give an example. And then if it ever says this thing is happening here and it doesn't give me the rules for it or give me kind of any support or the support that I need, I can just use this understanding that I have. So I kind of have this tool here and I can say, okay, I got this because I can plug my own tool thing into it and I can use what I've got to sort of replace or bolster or both the whatever's in this product that I have. That's kind of my so there's sort of the two prongs, and who knows how I don't know how ultimately successful it is. I know that this is something I intend to use, and kind of part of why I'm writing all this out because I want to do a lot of stuff, and I want to be able to reference something. And particularly after the whole OGL thing, I just was thinking, like, you know what? Why don't I just have my own thing with some of my own tools that I can just always have that, and it'll always be mine, and I won't have to worry about any kind of hot nonsense going on. And but I also thought like there's some stuff I want to say, some things I think are useful and kind of put out. So those are kind of my goals behind what this thing will end up being. But I really I these streams are invaluable to me because like I said, talking it out, I was like say like I said, but as I've said many times, talking this stuff out helps me think through it in a way that just staring at your keyboard or whatnot isn't going to do. I'm not sure what else. Is there anybody have any thoughts, questions, comments, whatever? I'm trying to think if there's anything. I know we talked about these. These are in the blog. Yeah, resources. How much resources? I thought about. I don't know if there's a. I don't know. It's kind of a. Or, maybe I should just put. Actually, I could probably move this other way. I'm not sure about something I'd like to explore. It's probably outside the scope of what I'm doing right now. But is there a kind of an easy way to mechanize a resource level? That'll be kind of an interesting thing that could. I haven't figured out what this might look like, but it's an interesting question. So the idea, the concept here would be, and it could work for multiple things, right? This is where you could think about these same tools could work for domains as well as buildings that your players are doing. It doesn't have to be necessarily a dungeon. You're thinking about these questions that I posed yesterday and on the blog about like, well, you can't put sentinels everywhere because they cost money. Right? You have, and just to put in just plain terms, you have so much money or money equivalent resources. And every time you employ someone, right? We're in a society now where everybody can have or almost everybody can have these very specialized jobs that depend on other people because we go to the supermarket to get food. We don't have to go to the farm and and make our own crops or go hunting, right? We've got storehouses and all these things, all these mechanisms which allow us to get into these very specific, very defined, very out there sort of fields that are far and far away from actual production of stuff because we got enough people, enough tools, and enough capacity and technology to have a few people work on the stuff making, the actual resource generation. The rest of us can consume the resources and do other things. If you're just a little group of goblins, 12 strong, if you have two guards, then you are really diminishing your ability to create resources, which you need. I mean, I think that's something we don't, it's one of the arguments always I think people have had against kind of the funhouse dungeon is you have things in places that like, how does it get here? How does it live here? Right. And I'm not really trying to tackle all of that, but it is interesting to think about because I think it does make things a richer place. If you have some dungeons or sorry, you have some goblins in the far corner of your dungeon and you've put all your creatures and you realize that you have these goblins that are out in some corner, don't have access to the outside world, are literally in a corner where they got to move through two or three other factions to get outside. It'd be really interesting to think about, well, how do those goblins coexist with other creatures? Because right, either the goblins are dominating those creatures, forcing them to go out and bring back, which could be one way to do it, they are the dominated ones, or they've found some kind of mutually beneficial relationship. And that stuff makes your dungeon richer, those kinds of things, because that's also stuff that the players can hook into. All that stuff becomes fodder for the players to gunk up the works, which is great. Redcap says, roll a d6. That's the number of resources. Roll that number of d4s, and that is the HD level of each of the resources. Oh, that's interesting. I was just gonna think maybe you total up the HD of the producer. I mean, this isn't perfect, right? If we're using hit dice, it doesn't always work because some things are low hit dice. And you think, well, that's maybe shouldn't be. And some things have a lot of hit dice, not because that an ogre isn't necessarily a more efficient farmer than a kobold. I mean, you might say, well, they're stronger, they're faster. Yeah, but they're not as clever. So maybe the kobold, depending on your conception of kobolds, has gotten all kinds if you're doing like a Tucker's kobold sort of thing, giving you gets you more bang for your buck, or the ogre does, or but it also could, whatever. But I'm okay using it because we just go, you know what? At the end of the day, fine. Um, and these are all things I'm just asking questions. Dave says their first GM gave them the best advice. These creatures are in an ecosystem. What do they eat? Where do they live? Where's their refuse? What do they care about? Who are their friends? The more questions you answer, the more real your world will feel. Yeah, I agree with that. I think we can take it too far sometimes because there are stuff that you get to a certain level depending on how deep you go, where the answers become less and less relevant to the stuff that's the most important. But certainly, I think when you get to these kind of higher level first order questions, the stuff that's really player facing, and right, the stuff that's gonna come out at the table, if you have parties, and a lot of OSR parties, I would venture to say most of them go pretty big on the divide and conquer type approach. Let's see if we can make friends with one and get them to get the other right, because we can't the old saw, but we can't fight them all, so we gotta try to figure things out. These kinds of first order questions like Dave posted, where do they live? What do they care about? Those are all things that have can, if utilized, have really direct ramifications on stuff the players can do. And that just gives the players more resources to do all comes up with all kinds of fun, crazy stuff. You can't get lost in that because you can go down some rabbit holes of like questions, 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 questions. And at a certain point, it's like that's great if you just want to answer questions. It's kind of that, hey, if you love world building, then yeah, go world build. But then at a certain point, you got to know that that world building is just for you as a world builder, and it's not really about the game anymore. Just something to keep in mind, right? It's kind of always, when I can try to pull back and say, like, am I? Because I also like that idea of keeping things kind of unknown a little bit. Like, well, what do they do down there? Like, I'm not sure yet. But we'll find out a little bit later and hear the players' ideas, hear different things, right? But certainly these kind of top level first order questions, as I've been calling them, can be super, super useful. And then they just make you, and like Dave says, they make your world feel more real. It makes those dungeons seem more interesting because you got things going on. It'll open up pathways for you in terms of your design, not only just the physical design, but how all these factions or things are working together. RPG Grandma says right at the end, I bet. Yep, pretty much RPG Grandma. I hear you, RPG Grandma. I'm playing. I slip away from work to do this, and I have meetings soon, so I gotta I gotta slip back in the mode. I want to squeeze in a stream, so I did. So maybe that'll be the next thing. That probably won't be it. This idea of the resource management part is really interesting. I don't think I'm ready to I don't wanna hold up other stuff to get this out, but that might be I have to think about some other kind of thing where we get into the kind of resource part, because I think some kind of budget, and then what you do with that budget would be interesting. Some interesting rules that you could come up with, or at least guidelines for what's going on. And by the way, like this kind of stuff, right, it really makes you appreciate magic and the impact of things like magic users or necromancers or enchanters or whatever, because they can change. I mentioned this in the blog just kind of in passing, but they can really change the calculus. You can't afford much security because you have no, everyone's got to be out working, right? You're a small goblin clan, Everybody's out working. You can't even spare a single person. But then what if the leader of your goblin clan was a goblin necromancer or something? Well, now they can create some skeletons. Now that's taken a burden off of you. Now you get this free sentinels that you don't have to pay for because the thing has done it. You know, your necromancer boss has thrown them out there. That's a big boon. Now you can those are resources that go towards something else. So it's or if you're able to make a construct, it's, different magic, same kind of result, or something else. Like what could you come up with some clever ways to get around some of these resource costs? And that could be some interesting things to play with in different designs. What did these guys do? Were they able to do something like in Caves of Chaos and hire an ogre to sleep in one room, and therefore act as sort of a guard, right? Just by default. Like it's no one wants to fight the ogre, presumably. So the ogre you feed them and then they sit there and then your guys now granted you're paying the ogre in food but you don't have to train them, you don't have to do it, you don't need an ogre, you don't need a uh, and a ogre tech or anything. It's like you just feed the ogre and then the ogre sits there, and so yeah, you got to feed them but then still get everybody working. You don't need somebody to watch the ogre because what is one of you guys going to stop the ogre from doing if they want to do it anyway? RPG Grandma says the dungeon bouncer. Indeed. Well, all right, folks. On that note, I hope this was useful. Thanks for, being my, I guess my what bouncing board, bouncing whatever for some of this stuff. Hopefully, fairly soon, I'll have at least a first version that's going to tie some of the stuff together in something usable. It's going to be made to kind of sit on top of my do anything D6. Not that you can't pull it out and do whatever you want with it, but just in terms of what the shape of it is going to look like, it's gonna kind of be like that. Um, yeah, but that's it. What is today? Thursday? So the weekend's swiftly coming upon us. I'm glad I got to get this in because a lot of Thursdays I feel kind of rushed. I've got my game nights tonight, and I have one or two meetings depending on the Thursday that I can't skip out on. And if it's this is the week where I have just the one meeting. If I had the two meetings, I don't even know if I'd been able to stream today. But I lucked out. So hopefully that luck will stay strong. Hopefully you guys have a great rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching or listening to this. Game on, everybody. And I'll talk to you later. Bye now.